Beginning in the 1970s, and particularly the later 1970s, the UFO abduction phenomenon just seems to explode, where you have people telling the most incredible, fantastic, unbelievable stories of being taken aboard UFOs by humanoid beings and subjected to tests. There are some cases claiming sexual contact between humans and humanoids. Some cases of people claiming they were taken even to other worlds in spaceships. These stories are just fantastically unbelievable. Many of them, though not all of them, are elicited through hypnosis, which has its own problems. But there are also people making conscious claims.
The abduction phenomenon was with us from the beginning, but nobody realized it. It took us about from 1947 to 1961, about 14 years to discover the abduction phenomenon.
These people are different from the contactees. They're not marginal types with a long history of occultism. Most of them don't have any history of confidence crime. They're just normal people. In fact, they pretty much have the profile of other kinds of UFO witnesses to less extraordinary manifestations of the phenomenon.
Well, the first case, the Villas Boas case in Brazil, was not really widely known in the United States. I mean, the Betty Barney Hill case was the one that got the front page, so to speak, here. But the Villas Boas case was reported in England first in depth. And it was fascinating because the man went out on a tractor and was more or less paralyzed. The creatures came, took him into the craft, and the basic thing is that there was some kind of sexual act which involved him and what seems to be a half alien, half human female figure. His attitude towards the figure was that she made sort of animal-like noises, and but wasn't too unusual looking. I think he said she had red hair, as I remember. But one of the things is that before they had sex, something was put over his body, some liquid or mist or something, which made him throw up. And I always thought that one detail tended to add a lot of veracity, because if you're making up some sort of wild sexual encounter inside a UFO, you're not going to bring in the part that you vomited. That's not going to be. It's not going to make it more pleasant. Well, I think right now it fits the patterns that we've been looking at for a long time. It was when people in the United States, researchers, heard about it, they didn't like it because of the sexual component, the reproductive component. She ostensibly pointed to her belly and then pointed up to the sky, implying that she was going to be carrying his baby. And that was, of course, obviously kind of an upsetting thing for people to have to deal with because it was so tabloid-ish. But yet, as the thing went on and began finding out more and more about the abduction phenomenon, that became central, this reproductive part, not necessarily the sexual part, but the fact that reproduction is the goal. It's hard to know much about this case, but one of the things is the fact that he was evidently considered by the investigators a very solid citizen, and he went on to become a lawyer, actually, and I think he's now dead. But there was never any sense that he was inventing this, and he seemed to have been pretty terrified by the whole thing.
People were having very odd experiences early on, which we could not possibly interpret or recognize. It wasn't until 1961, here in the United States, when the Barney and Betty Hill case took place, that people began to understand that people were claiming that they were being abducted. At least these people were. Barney and Betty Hill were not like the contactees of the 1950s. They were not charlatans. They weren't trying to make a buck off the deal. They were not people who were prone to telling tall tales and that sort of thing. And consequently, they were taken much more seriously than all the rest of the contactees put together. But one story does not a phenomenon make. And what you're looking for, of course, is patterns. And with Barney and Betty Hill, we didn't quite know how to approach it, how to study it, how to understand what was happening. However, after Barney and Betty Hill, there was a sporadic group of UFO reports that of abduction reports that came through from time to time. Still nothing that was looking like a pattern other than the fact that people were being abducted and examined.
The basic thing about that case was, of course, it was the first one we had ever really heard about. It wasn't necessarily the first case. And as I got involved in these cases, looking into them years later, I ran into two that occurred in the 1920s, many that happened in the 1930s and 40s. So it was far from being the first. It was simply the first that we heard about. My history of all this was that I had a sighting in 1964, which is just a sighting. When I read about the Hill case 2 years later, in 66, I just thought it was ridiculous. I couldn't accept it. I could go up to as far as what I had experienced. That was okay. Something flying around that I could observe in the daylight. But an abduction, I thought, just can't accept it. But the more I read about it, the more I began to think I had no real reason to reject this account. These people seemed to have gotten themselves in a great deal of personal trouble by even bringing it up. Actually, they didn't want the story out. And the really interesting thing about it was, of course, that everyone assumed, since this happened on a lonely road in the White Mountains, that this was just a case of two people who were unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, so that it could be seen as an extremely rare event. But in actual fact, of course, there's a lot of reason to believe Betty had had a number of experiences before this happened, and Barney's behavior suggests, although I never knew him, that he had earlier experiences too. But what's crucial about that case is how many facets of the later reports that we've gotten left, right, and the center what came out of that case before we had a chance to even think about it. First, the whole issue of missing time from that case, where they could not recall between point A and point B what happened. The second thing, of course, were the examination on a table and the idea of a reproductive procedure where a needle was put in her navel. They told her it was some sort of pregnancy test, but at least the word pregnancy gets into that. And a sperm sample was definitely taken from Barney Hill, even though that was not mentioned in the book because it was seen as unseemly. And interestingly, once laparoscopy was developed, we began using the navel as a place of entry medically to see what was going on in the ovaries and so on. But at the time this happened, doctors were saying, a needle in the navel has nothing to do with anything. And of course, the fact that hypnosis, for the first time that we're aware of, was used in that case, administered by a skeptic who didn't like what was happening as the stories emerged. And so there were so many kind of basic issues there that just kept being repeated again and again and again. So in a way, it's really extraordinarily important for the fact that it laid down the terms, although they didn't know that at the time, for what the shape the phenomenon was about to take.
Eventually, the cases began to build up more and more and more and more until they demanded attention. Right. The evidence for them could not be dismissed as the ravings of lunatics. We had to finally figure out a way to investigate these on some sort of level that had depth. This was a very difficult thing to do. What gave us, of course, the entree was hypnosis, and hypnosis was used with the Barney and Betty Hill case. Now, Benjamin Simon, who was a very famous hypnotist at the time, really didn't know how to do hypnosis with abductees, obviously, since nobody did, and didn't know what questions to ask, and didn't know how to interpret the answers. So that's where we actually had to do the most of our learning, was how to investigate this properly using a question and answer technique through hypnosis. And but before that, there was the Pascagoula case, which was in 1973, and the problem with the Pascagoula case was that the main people who were involved with it, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, Hickson described aliens that nobody had ever described before, so it didn't fit a pattern, and Parker refused to talk about it. So it was very difficult to get a handle on that case. With the Travis Walton case, a few years later, you have a situation where he's gone for 4.5 or 5 days, and you have actually two events. You have the event of people seeing him being knocked over by a ball of light from a UFO or whatever it was, and then his story, what happened to him after that. So you have two separate accounts here, essentially. He didn't remember much about the abduction event, but the other people remembered seeing him being abducted or seeing him being knocked over or whatever. The point is that Travis, who was remarkably intelligent and well-spoken, has steadfastly decided not to do hypnosis. So he only remembered about 20 minutes or so of what happened to him over a 5-day period.
Of course, that case was important because, apart from the fact that he was taken for 5 days, but it was one of the first cases where people were reporting beings which looked like sort of super perfect normal humans who were interacting with the aliens. We would now think of these beings as hybrids of some sort, whatever. To my recollection, he only did one hypnotic regression with it. And I've gotten to know Travis over the years, and I think extremely highly of him. He's a wonderful man. But the thing is that he's just not wanted to look into it anymore. The thing was sufficiently terrifying to him.
It was a very, very traumatic time. This incredible thing, that how can I relate this to, the guys that were with me, I wasn't really all that close of friends with. I could connect with them on what, the part of the experience that we had shared. But as far as anyone else, there were no experts. There were no one that I could really, connect with that understood the situation. And, I had this incredible, trauma to deal with. At the same time, an onslaught from the media and all sorts of things being said. They were trying to dismiss it as a drug hallucination, a transitory psychosis, just on and on, and that just had me completely, it was unexpected. I was off balance because, the depth of the reality for me had no bearing on people's reaction to it, and a lot of it had to do with fear. And
you were 22. You were still very young.
Yeah, I was only 22 and very unsophisticated about a lot of things about the so-called experts, and it was a tough time.
He'll talk about that one experience. And of course, I think one of the worst things in the world for him was the fact that the skeptics, the debunkers, jumped on him with both feet, and class, and he had to spend all of this time trying to defend himself. And that doesn't make you want to go more deeply into your recollections. At that time, 1975, we assumed maybe there 10 abductions took place, give or take a few. And many people didn't even like to accept the idea that there were 10. But it was still regarded, as with the Hill case, you were just unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And so I began having hypnosis done. I took these people for the first 7 years of my research. I took them to other people for the hypnotic regressions. It was the longest apprenticeship probably anybody who was doing hypnosis has ever had to go through. But when we did this, case after case emerged. And I began thinking, this isn't some 10 cases that, unlucky people in the wrong place. This is fairly widespread. And I think when I finally got around to writing my book in the late 70s, it came out in 81, Missing Time, perhaps the most radical thing that I wrote about and discovered is that the scope of this thing is enormous. This isn't just some very few people.
There's a sequence of episodes that do not appear in every abduction story, but if they appear, they tend to appear in the same order. Now, the first episode is the capture, which of course is going to happen in any case, but it in itself turns out to be a complex episode. You'll either have people seeing a UFO, it comes nearer, and then at some point something starts to go funny. There's something about their consciousness or their awareness of the environment, or the environment itself, as the case may be, that starts to become very strange. Things aren't perceived as they normally would be. They have odd feelings. And then there's going to be some kind of appearance of alien beings, or a time lapse. Sometimes the time lapse occurs first, sometimes the beings appear first. But anyway, there will be a loss of consciousness, and then the things that aren't remembered immediately after the event will be that these alien beings take the individual onto the spaceship, which may either be landed or it may be in the sky and pulls them up. Now the alternative is they wake up at night, they feel a sense of paralysis, alien beings come into the room and spirit them away again. So it's a slightly different beginning, but the two converge. You go into the ship. Then the second episode begins, which is the examination. And this is almost always the first thing the aliens do. They start giving the captive a physical examination. This episode also has a lot of parts to it. The examination usually runs in the course of where the beings give a sort of tactile examination, touching the captive after having laid them out on a table, and then there's a scanning device or an eye-like device that comes down. And then there's some kind of neurological examination or an implant or removal of an implant. There's also the staring in the eyes of the captive.
The scanning.
Scanning, yeah, the mind scan.
Right.
And then there's the sexual removal, body fluids removal. It can be other body parts too, but it always comes down to the sexual part. Then there may be some kind of follow-up, some kind of mental examination, some kind of scenarios that appear that seem to be some kind of mental or emotional test for the captive. Then there's a third episode, which is a conference or some kind of communication between the captive and at least one of the aliens. It can be kind of a one-on-one conversation. It can be a sort of lecture. It can be a sort of showing of images of some kind. And this isn't as quite as well organized an episode, but
is there any thematic to that?
Yeah, there are themes to what the aliens say, which is almost always some kind of a warning that a time of tribulation is at hand, and a promise that the aliens are going to help, and they charge the captive with some kind of mission or purpose.
Usually, this warning is ecological.
Yeah, most often. And the mission is to somehow ameliorate the effects, but the person doesn't really know what their mission is. It's something they'll understand when the time is right. That's pretty much the way it goes.
Bud Hopkins, of course, is one of the great pioneers, if not the great pioneer in this area. And he wrote a book called Missing Time in 1980, which came out in 1981. And in that book, he took 7 individuals, which was the first time that there had been a sort of comparative study of that sort, who had all been abductees, and put them all together and showed that there were certain similarities that you just couldn't overlook, that it wasn't sort of all over the map like we had been seeing before, that in fact that they all had unusual scars on their body, or a lot of them did, and that they weren't crazy, and that they were actually missing from their normal environments, and that there was all sorts of things he found. And to me, the book, I at that time in 1980, 81, was of the mind that the abductions were primarily psychological. And therefore, when I met Bud Hopkins, I had not bothered to read his book, because why waste the time? And but when Bud began to show me what he was doing, and he actually introduced me to an abductee, then I read the book, and the book, of course, was, I think that Missing Time really began modern research into the subject of abductions. It was a groundbreaking book. It was a very, very, very important book. Now, there have been many books written beforehand, but his book had a seriousness to it, using a psychologist to do hypnosis. It had a methodology to it that other ones didn't have. It made sense on many levels that other ones didn't. It had a completeness to it that other ones didn't. And I became interested in the subject then.
What I also discovered and wrote about at the time was the fact that this seemed to be something that happens again and again in someone's life. Up until that point, everybody thought, whether it's Travis or Charlie Hickson and whatnot, it was a one-time shot. But and Charlie and I have talked about some recollections of his that go back to earlier times too. Mm-hmm. So suddenly it was a much more targeted thing. The person was abducted again and again, and then I discovered that there were particular kinds of marks on people afterwards, that scars and these straight line cuts and so on remained. And all this was really new. And then I discovered that it seemed to happen in families, that a child of abductee parents might have the same thing happen to him or her. So suddenly the thing expanded exponentially as a possibility, instead of these little few accidental things that happen. The point about this range of aspects of the phenomenon that I had really sort of uncovered and was writing about in Missing Time for the first time is that I was, in a certain sense, sticking my neck out, because other researchers are going to say, well, I've never found anything like this myself. There's nothing to this. Or counterintuitive evidence is going to come forward and so forth. And yet, in actual fact, people began saying, my gosh, when I explore these other avenues, I'm finding the same thing he found.
In 1987, 2 important books came out. Intruders, which was Bud Hopkins' second book, an extremely important book that sort of documented one woman and her family's experiences with the abduction phenomenon.
And raised a very important point, that point of the hybrid.
And raised the point of the hybrids, which Bud had already discovered. Bud had discovered back in the early 80s that women were being shown babies that looked odd, that looked sort of a mixture of human and alien, and he called them hybrids. He's the one who actually coined the phrase, coined the word for that type of person. And in Intruders, he also brought this in as a function of the abduction phenomenon and of this family, what had happened to this family, who this woman met, who she considered to be her daughter there, or a daughter. And at the same time, almost in the same week, the book Communion came out, written by an abductee, a person who claims to be an abductee, Whitley Strieber. And Strieber was a professional writer and had best-selling books, and two of his books have been made into movies. And there had been a sort of bidding war for his book, and so he sold it to Morrow Company for a tremendous amount of money, and there was a huge publicity campaign for it, and he had hired his own publicist as well for it, and it hit the top of the New York Times bestseller list. It was on the New York Times bestseller list for 32 weeks, and it was #1 in the country for 19 weeks. That book had a tremendous impact societally. And the impact was not so much what he had to say, which was important enough, but was the illustration on the cover done by a man named Ted Jacobs, who actually was a friend of Bud Hopkins and who introduced Whitley to him. And Ted Jacobs, no relation to me, did this sort of staring alien that absolutely frightened the devil out of people who might have had these experiences. They became scared to death. People told me they saw the book in a bookstore and they just ran. They ran out of the mall and kept running. They were so frightened. Or people were drawn to it eerily. They couldn't stop looking at it. And some of these people eventually wound up with doing hypnosis with Bud or with me, and they would always say, you know, I had that book, I bought that book, and I could never look at it, and I kept it covered down so I didn't have to have that alien staring at me. But I know that there's something was wrong. The shape of the head was wrong. There was something wrong with it. And of course they were correct. The aliens don't look like that. They have different shaped heads than what Ted Jacobs painted, essentially. And they all knew it. And oddly enough, well, it's not odd if you know anything about the abduction phenomenon, but the starkness of the staring eyes is what affected them. And so what Communion did was it pried loose hundreds, if not thousands of people in the society who understood right away that they might have had these experiences, and this is what they had seen, these eyes, this being who was staring at them, but the head was wrong.
How was it wrong?
It was too flat.
Too flat?
After 1987, the media became much more interested in the abduction phenomenon, and there was sort of an avalanche of shows that featured it, and it was a very good ratings getter and so forth. And so it became much more current in popular culture and in popular mythology, let's just say, certainly in popular thought. In 1991, Bud Hopkins and I were commissioned to do a poll to see how many people out there might have had abduction experiences. The problem is that you can't ask a person if they've had an abduction experience, because this is a phenomenon where people forget what has happened to them within seconds of it happening. It is also a phenomenon that is lifelong, that begins in infancy, and that occurs with fairly regular consistency and sometimes with great frequency. In spite of that, people still don't know what happened to them, so they interpret odd experiences which they know they've had as religious, or as New Agey, or as traveling on the astral plane, or as near-death experiences, or whatever it is that the society allows them to interpret it as. But being abducted is not one of those things that the society will allow. So they know that they've had a lifetime of strange experiences, whereas their friends haven't. So we couldn't just ask them, have they been abducted? So what we did was we understood the methodological problems in this. I know it's been criticized by people who have no idea what they're talking about. But in fact, what we did is we did a long test of the questions we were going to ask with all sorts of people who were abductees and all sorts of people who were non-abductees, and we saw how they answered the questions. We could only ask 10 questions approximately. And we winnowed about 60 questions down to 10 that we thought that abductees answered yes to in very high proportion and non-abductees answered no to in very high proportion. And those were some of the questions we asked, along with a couple of control questions. One question was, does the word Trondant, which Bud Hopkins sort of made up, but in fact is a word we learned, but not in use. Right. Does the word Trondant have special meaning for you? Anybody who answered yes was dropped from the poll. And the other one was, have you ever seen a UFO? And we have had statistics on that since 1949. So we knew early on how the statistics about seeing a UFO have gone. We knew pretty well, with all sorts of polls taken to the Gallup organization and other organizations, what the numbers should be like. So if the numbers were much higher, then we knew that there's something wrong with the poll. Right. It wasn't a good cross-section of the country. Well, the numbers were 7%, the lowest that had ever been recorded up to that time for have you seen a UFO, which was good, because that was a conservative poll. The poll was asked face-to-face, which they don't do anymore in polling, and it was an omni poll, but with omni polls, you're asked a series of questions that have to do with toothpaste and deodorant and flying saucers and all sorts of things. We stipulated, and they agreed to, that they would only ask questions that had to do with political events or sociological events and nothing that had to do with advertising, so that the person who was answering the poll questions knew it was a serious poll. Okay. We then asked these questions, none of which were you ever abducted? The best we could do was, well, when we got the numbers were so high in terms of answering yes that we knew that something was wrong politically. We could not go forward with these numbers. They were too high. So we arbitrarily made the numbers smaller by saying that we will take, of the 10 questions, 5 will be the 5 highest indicator questions, which we decided, and 5 would be the lower indicator questions. And if you answered, if you didn't answer yes to 3 or more of the higher indicator questions, you didn't make the poll. So if you answered yes to, let's just say, 7 questions out of 10, and you didn't answer yes to 3 of the higher indicator questions, you're dropped from the poll. Answering yes to any one of those questions was a good indicator that you might have had abduction experiences, even one. So we made it so they had to answer yes to a whole bunch of these questions to make the poll, otherwise they were just dropped. And when we did that, we cooked the numbers down to an ultra-conservative 2% of the American public has had experiences that abductees have had before they knew they were abductees. And that's as good as we could do. That poll has stood up. There have been all sorts of attempts to show how the numbers are wrong. The numbers aren't wrong. The numbers are really good. They've had other polls which showed the numbers are lower. Some have showed the numbers are higher. But that poll remains still one of the best ever taken, and giving us the clearest indication in a most conservative way imaginable about how many people have had abduction experiences. Now, we can't really tell until you investigate each and every one of them. But you have to remember, we did 3 2,000-person scientifically randomized sweeps across the country. 6,000 people were interviewed for that poll. It was the largest poll of its type ever taken, and it was done scientifically by the Roper organization. And the plus minus on that error rate was only 1.4%. So we had a very interesting poll, People have liked to take pot shots at it, and sociologists have tried to say, well, the numbers are here, and Carl Sagan said, well, this and that. The fact remains that this is still one of the best polls taken. There have been other attempts to do it, most of them inferior. People have asked them straight out, have you ever been abducted? The problem is that about 1 million people will say yes if you believe the numbers. But usually it falls within the plus minus. It doesn't rise above the plus minus. But that has happened. And then people have tried to add questions about conspiracy. Do you believe in conspiracy? The sort of extraneous questions and things like that. However, those numbers it's a very good poll, and those numbers hold up very well, I think.
2% of the population is still a huge number of people.
We couldn't get it down any lower than 2%. We wanted to. We just couldn't do it because the real numbers were just much too high.
Really?
That we couldn't get it down to more than to that.
What did that mean to you at that point?
Well, we knew that the numbers were wrong. Okay. We knew that right away that 2% was wrong, but it was impossible. We knew that no matter what number we came up with, it was going to be too high, no matter what it was.
All right, so if it was wrong.
But it was conservative, and we really didn't know. And if we were ridiculously rigid and ultra conservative, we would probably be more accurate. I don't know whether that's true or not. We may have been more accurate, we may not have been, but at least we were covering ourselves, and 2% is one hell of a lot of people in real numbers. You take 2% of 300 million people, that's 6 million right there. That's a lot of people. It's too many people. It's just plain too many. No matter what number it is, it's too many. You have to remember that most people thought that you're dealing with hundreds of people, maybe. Not anywhere close to thousands or millions. That just doesn't make any sense.
There's at least two reasons why I think abductions aren't as frequent. In part, abductions are kind of they were faddish in the 90s. But not faddish like hula hoops or something. They were faddish in a way like they gave people a script they could use to explain anomalous experiences they'd already had anyway in their life. So the 2 Roper polls have been done on abductions. The first and then the second in the late 90s. And there's a vast difference between the estimates about the number of abductees between the 2 polls. I.e., the abduction incidents dropped by 50 or 60 or 70% in only 4 or 5 years. Well, that makes no sense, okay? Unless, of course, there's other factors involved with being an abductee. Okay? So that's one thing I think about. But the other is that in the late 90s and in the early aughts or O's, whatever we call this, the decade we're in, we being the UFO Coalition, were working on an abduction research project where we were actually placing devices in the home abductees and attempting to measure physical phenomena there. In the course of that, I literally had to interview hundreds of people around the country to find subjects for the study. So I've talked to many, many, many people fairly recently about their experiences. And what I found is that when you question them closely about the frequency of occurrence, which we had to because we wanted to find people who were abducted at least more than once in their lifetime, it turns out that everything is very vague, except a few things. In other words, yes, they've had 1 or 2 experiences, whatever they were, but everything else is more along the lines of, I woke up this morning and I think I saw a spot of blood in my nose, and I think last night was one of those nights again. Now, it may well be, but it's vague. And so I can't, and those 2 things are things I've grasped. The Roper poll, I understand. I've talked to hundreds of potential abductees or real abductees, and I just don't see these large numbers there.
Well, it is around this time, around 1991 or so, that John Mack from Harvard enters into the area. John had a spectacular career at Harvard for 30 years, winner of the 1976 Pulitzer Prize in biography for a biography of T.E. Lawrence, and a Harvard psychiatrist and founders of one of the institutes at Harvard, and on the op-ed page of the New York Times all the time, and a tremendous career, extraordinarily intelligent, very insightful. And he immediately understood when he went to one of Bud Hopkins' lectures and Bud can explain this more than I can, obviously, but he immediately understood that this would be very difficult to prove as being psychologically originated. In other words, the abduction phenomenon is either psychological for whatever reason you want to bring in, no matter what. It is psychological or it's actually happening. So John comes on the scene, and we are thrilled because John has got a sort of cachet, obviously, about him that we obviously don't have. And John is plugged into an intellectual community that is really extraordinary. And John has the ability, therefore, to influence other people in a positive way for us and for the phenomenon and for perhaps an intellectual and scientific engagement with the phenomenon that we have been hoping for. Sure. I mean, so we were very, very thrilled with that. But John had sort of another take on things. John had studied with Stanislav Grof and
transpersonal psychology.
Right, and he was very much into consciousness studies and transference of consciousness and the transformational aspects of being abducted and the spiritual aspects of being abducted. What exactly was happening, he wasn't much interested in. And the methodology to ask the correct questions was not high on his priority list. So when he began to do his work, the first thing we noticed was that he was not coming to us for advice. After all, we had many years of experience in this between the two of us, Bud Hopkins and I. And he just went off and started to do it. And he was not given the gift that I was given. So he made the fatal mistake of simply believing everything that people say at face value and not understanding that people will say things that are not true in hypnosis. And you've got to be there to be careful and to watch that and to catch that. So he believed everything he heard, and his idea of what the phenomenon was very different than what Bud and I had been finding for years. But he never quite believed that we were on the right track even before he began to do hypnosis.
Well, I think one of the key differences was in their approach, in that I believe that Hopkins and Jacobs were focused on the aliens themselves. They wanted to know about what this alien culture was, what the species was, what their methods were. John's approach was a little bit different, in that I think his interest was actually in the people. He was looking at how the people were changed by the experience. And that's sort of the common theme which all of his explorations were about. You know, we investigated T.E. Lawrence. He was looking to see how a person, when exposed to a completely different culture, how their relationship to the world changed. That happened to this T.E. Lawrence, who was a British officer stationed in the Middle East, who he basically embraced the concept that the Middle East could unite and become a powerful country. So when he met these alien encounter experiencers, he was seeing people who were taking on a different kind of cultural identity, an identity in which they were related not only to their own country, but to life in the world and life beyond our world. So that was what fascinated John most and what kept him interested for years. The matter of fact, the nuts and bolts aspects of the experiences, John was first to admit that was beyond his area of expertise. He was a psychiatrist, so he was using the art of speaking to people. That's fantastic for learning how people have changed, but as an investigative method, it's not going to turn up hardcore evidence. So I think that was the beginning of the divide.
I had the great privilege and pleasure of talking to John Mack at some length. I know that he's been blasted a number of times by skeptics and even some people within his own institution. I found him to be a brilliant individual. I was impressed with his approach, and particularly impressed with his second book, The Passport to the Cosmos. If you look at the second book, what it does is it says, well, maybe abductions aren't real in the sense that people are being beamed up through the ceiling, but because what he found was, for example, that somebody would report being abducted. Some would be in the same room at the same time, and they'd notice the person asleep on the couch. But what Mack did was he attached tremendous psychological significance to abductions. And I think this is He's referred to as a positivist as compared to a realist, like Jacob, say, oh, gee, this is really happening. And I think that there are transformational kinds of effects for some people of abduction. Some are terrified, some don't make sense of it. But in the hands of somebody like Mac, who would help people work through and understand these experiences, the outcome could be positive. There's certainly been other cases where people have had anomalistic or mystical kinds of experiences that can be channeled. I think that one of the reasons for Mac's success in working with individual abductees was that he did see it as positive, and he helped other people to see it in the same way.
He already sort of had, I think, a kind of a template, in essence, into which he would place this phenomenon. And that's what essentially he did. So he wrote his major book, which was called Abduction, and I noticed that he put in transcripts of his hypnosis. And I knew immediately when reading transcripts, I knew instantly what the problem was. He was simply going along with what other people said and agreeing with them and believing what they were saying, no matter what they said, and then asking them to come forward with more information about this material that was obviously, in my opinion, confabulation, and building what I called a mutually confirmational fantasy. This is a fantasy built by the hypnotist and the subject. And he did that over and over again. He got all sorts of stuff about going back to the pyramids and, and everything that matched nothing that Bud and I and other serious researchers had gotten. Nothing at all, except the standard kind of scenario, giving people an examination, all that. And when there was stuff like taking eggs and sperm, he just dismissed all that stuff. He didn't think that was important. He emphasized other things that were oftentimes confabulatory that were important. So the book was not a forward step for us.
The emphasis on the part of some researchers to stress the physical aspects of the experience seemed to be almost a concession to the culture. Like, rather than approach the experience and say, well, this is a very strange experience, very surreal, has all these strange elements, some researchers try to reduce it and say, no, it's very physical. It's a metal saucer landing on your yard. And that might be one part of it, but it seems almost dishonest. It seems like it's an attempt to buy into the public's expectations of what an alien encounter is. So I don't appreciate when some people ignore the high strangeness of the experiences. I think that you have to embrace that. And that's what appealed to me about John, was that he embraced the spiritual component perhaps more than his colleagues. But that was intentional. He wanted to make sure that there was balance by emphasizing that element in his books. Well, as John has told it, he was fairly high profile in the media. He was getting a lot of good coverage for his book. And the suspicion is that some Harvard donors might have become a little upset that their alma mater was becoming associated with this subject. So he went to the dean's office to let the dean know that he was on this publicity tour, and he would be for the next several weeks. And the way he describes it was, at that point, it was too late. He walks into the room, and there was another dean there, and they give him a letter saying that this informal committee has been appointed to just investigate and see why he had the opinions that he had. And it was a little odd in that there had been no formal complaints brought against him. There was no specific allegation of any wrongdoing. It was an open-ended investigation with no apparent structure. It was simply a free-flowing investigation, and he didn't know what to make of it. And initially he thought that it was simply something harmless, but it developed into a 14-month excruciating experience where he had to defend himself rigorously against a panel of people who weren't, for the most part, were not psychiatrists, were not philosophers, really didn't have the background or expertise to even appreciate his work, let alone understand it. Well, I'm not sure why it took 14 months, but my impression, layman's impression, not part of the Harvard system at all, was that the Inquisition itself was the form of punishment. Because when they finally produced their report and presented it to the dean read their report, determined that nothing that they said merited any action, released a press release saying that John remained a faculty member in good standing, and that was it. So in a sense, the Inquisition itself was the message. Watch yourself because we're watching you. And that was actually what made some of the other Harvard faculty rather uncomfortable. Alan Dershowitz wrote a good op-ed where he was saying that kind of message in an open-ended investigation is unfair. So they finally brought it to a close, I think, after public scrutiny started to make some people uncomfortable. I think he felt that the experience that he was investigating was more important than the political system at Harvard. So he was willing to let the Harvard system, gnaw at him. It wasn't something that would stop him. I mean, as I said earlier, the interview process where he was speaking to experiencers was a personally satisfying experience for him. Mm-hmm. It was changing him from a psychiatrist into a kind of philosopher. Mm-hmm. And that passion wasn't going to be extinguished by an ad hoc committee. Well, I think John's influence was the fact that John, as a psychiatrist, was able to move people past their fear of the experiences and the trauma, just as if you had been through any terrifying experience, whether it's rape or being shot or anything like that. If you're caught in the fear, your perspective is not going to be wide enough to see the whole experience. The fact that other researchers report fear, well, it doesn't really surprise me. I mean, that's going to be the primary experience first, is fear.
How would you describe that primary? What is the reason for that fear?
I think the fear of an alien encounter experience, the fear once you've been through it, it undercuts all of your assumptions about reality. Which sounds like maybe is not that big a deal. Sounds like it's purely a philosophical problem, but you live your life assuming that reality is one way. That people can only come into your house by walking through a door. Okay, but when that element of certainty is taken away, you involuntarily question everything about yourself, which had been based upon those assumptions. So in a way, your personality is deconstructed temporarily, simply because you suddenly have immense doubt about reality, which taints your assumptions about yourself. So people's identities sort of fall apart when they become aware that they're having these experiences.
But eventually he realized the UFO research was not for him. And he dropped out of UFO research, closed up his peer group he had, as he called it, at Harvard, 2 years before he died, and just began to work more in spiritual realms. And that was what he was more suited for. That was really a better fit for him.
I think John was initially tantalized by the possibility that this experience could leave behind material proof. But after speaking to experiencer after experiencer, who most of them have repeat experiences throughout their lifetimes, none could bring forth any hardcore physical evidence. All they had were memories. So I think eventually John moved away from the idea that material evidence was part of it.
I began to think that the process of hybridization, which I had envisioned before as primarily taking sperm and eggs and then altering the embryo or the zygote, and then leading to this sort of a bell-shaped curve of part of them look alien, part of them look human, most of them look in the middle. That was probably true, but not the whole story. And then I began to realize that what they were doing is that they were adding DNA from hybrids to the sperm and egg, and they were getting a skewed bell-shaped curve that was looking more and more like humans. And if you do this enough time, you just get beings who look more and more human-like, more and more. You get a refining of the species, in a sense. And that apparently is what has been happening. Although how the process, I'm still a little bit unclear of the process, and there were some very pointed questions asked me about this once by a person who knew what he was talking about that I couldn't answer. And so I don't know all the medical procedures that occur here in that sense. But I do know that there is a spectrum of hybrids who look mainly alien and look mainly human, and some look really, really human. Then people would begin to describe to me how they would be taken into a room. These are abductees, and their attention would be directed to a screen-like device. They all look up at the screen, and the person will say, and I've written a couple of these kinds of events up, although I heard many of them. The person will see a picnic, for example. And at the picnic, there'll be people who are playing ball and who are grilling and who are standing around talking this and that. And they'll hear in their mind's eye, in their mind's ear, "Can you tell the difference between you and us?" And the person will look carefully at the screen and say, "No. Everybody looks the same to me, you know." And they'll say, "See? Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that excellent? Soon we will all be together. Soon we will be here and we will all be living together. Isn't that wonderful?" Or they will see, here's another case, it's a group shot of all sorts of people, like a high school shot of other class on steps, you know, that sort of thing. And they'll say, "Can you pick out us among you here?" And the person will look and try to figure it out and they'll say, no, I can't. And they'll say, "See, isn't that wonderful? Soon we will all be together." And I began to hear this a lot by people who were not aware of anybody else's testimony or anything like that, or, you know, who were just saying that, and who didn't really understand the meaning of what it was either. And then people would say, then these beings would tell them, soon there's going to be a big change. There'll be a big change, and you're going to be a very important part of the change, and, you know, you'll have a job to do, and you'll be very pleased to do it. And to the abductees who don't know what they're talking about. But this will happen soon. Everything's going to happen soon. It's going to be happening soon. Now that's the change. We're going to have a change. The change is coming soon. Well, I began, you know, when you hear things for the first time, you always put it on the back burner waiting for validation from other people who are unaware of the testimony. Sure. Well, so the first few times I heard this, you just blow it off. You just think, well, I'll wait. If I never hear it again, there is no change, you know. But I began to hear it over and over